Okay, I'm unmuted. Good. Can you hear me okay? Jesse Godfrey, can you hear me and see me?
Yes, sir.
You can see my screen?
I can.
Good. Okay. Before we get too far into this today, I wanted to answer a few questions that have come up about.
Professor, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Somebody was asking about my summer course and courses. I'm actually teaching 2 courses this summer that the system shows are synchronous, and they sort of are, but they're not completely synchronous. I'm teaching a course called Film in American Society, War Cinema. And the way that course is going to work is that we will meet only on Thursdays for 5 weeks in summer 1. And the rest of the course will be done asynchronously. You will watch 10 films that I will assign. You watch them on your own. And then on Thursdays, we will have a discussion about 2 of those films each week. And then you'll write a couple of papers. That's the film class, and it's a 3,000 level. And I think if you're a freshman, you can go ahead and register for that. If you're wanting to take a 4,000 level course and you happen to be a freshman, you need my permission to do that. So you'd have to send me a note asking to be admitted to the 4,000 level course, which is also only on Thursdays, once a week. In that one, you will write a larger paper, but it only meets once a week for 2 hours. So it's a combination of both asynchronous and synchronously, but it is an online course. You don't have to show up face to face for any of that, okay? All right. Today, we are going to talk about the American soldier in Vietnam. Now, I know that many of you have relatives who served in Vietnam. It's probably a grandpa now or a great uncle. And so the things I'm going to talk about today about soldiers in Vietnam, the American soldier, I'm also going to talk about the Vietnamese soldier a little bit. But what I want you to leave today's lecture is understanding what it was like to become a soldier in Vietnam. How did you get there? How did you exist while you were there? What did you try to do to stay out of it if you wanted to stay out of it? All of those kinds of things. We're going to essentially talk about a few things. Let me just get going here just a minute. Okay. So we'll talk about the fact that Vietnam is considered to be a working class war. Conscription, meaning that you might be forced to go to Vietnam. Some people decided to go on their own, or they decided to go and volunteer because they were able to determine exactly what job they wanted to have if they did go to Vietnam. How long were they there? Then I want to talk about African Americans, about women, and how the structure sort of was put together. So here's this guy. He is average age. He is 19 years old. That compares to soldiers in World War II with the average age being about 26. In the American Civil War, it was 25. The soldier in Vietnam, the average soldier, was too young to vote because the voting age was 21. He was too young to drink because the drinking age was 21, although today it's still 21. And he was probably from small town America. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't a lot of city guys that served in Vietnam, but the average soldier was probably from a small town in the United States some kind of a rural area. There has been a lot written about the fact that it was a working class war. There's actually a book called Working Class War, Vietnam, Working Class War. I would argue that most wars throughout history, most wars throughout the world, no matter when they were or where they were, they're probably working class. By that, I mean that most of the time, rich people don't send their kids off to war. Most of the time, people who are not that are not wealthy don't have the means to get out of serving in a combat situation. So they end up being forced into war either for socioeconomic reasons or because they can't avoid it and their parents don't want them to go, or their parents can keep them out of going. Generally speaking, we say that there was about 2.7 million men who served in the Vietnam War and about 68,000 women. Now, of the 68,000 women, about 11,000 were nurses, and the other 50,000 or so were either in desk jobs in Saigon, or they were civilians working for government agencies or working for private corporations in the rear or in Saigon. And as I talked about the other day, about 20% of the soldiers who served were in combat roles, and about 80% of them were in combat support or rear echelon jobs. And for those of you that looked up what rear echelon, what REMF stands for, I hope you got your answer. The draft. If you were between the ages of 18 and 25, you were eligible to be drafted. It's called conscription. You were eligible to be taken into the military. Generally speaking, it was the United States Army that drafted, although some people were drafted into the Marines. When you became eligible for the draft, your draft card, your eligibility said 1A. You were 1A. However, if you were a college student in any degree program in America, junior college or a full four-year college, you received a 2S deferment. If you had a 2S deferment, all you had to do was to maintain a 2.0 GPA. If your GPA dropped below 2.0, you were immediately reclassified 1A, eligible for the draft. Now, this caused a little bit of disparity among college students. A lot of college students that were, and I don't mean to be critical of any field that some of you may be studying today, but in those days, if you happened to be a student studying chemical engineering or mechanical engineering or finance or some field, excuse me, that was considered to be intellectually more rigorous than other fields, you might consider changing your major. I always make the joke that there were a lot of chemical engineers who decided to become sociology majors, because in those days, sociology was considered to be an easier major than chemical engineering. So I always say there's a bunch of 60-year-old sociologists running around today that decided to become sociologists instead of chemical engineers so they could make sure they didn't have to go to Vietnam. Once you were declared 1A eligible for the draft, you would have to go down and take a physical examination, and that physical examination would determine whether or not you had to go in the military. If you failed your physical exam by the military, you were classified 4F, physically disqualified to serve. Now, there's a lot of things that would get you physically disqualified. For example, there were a lot of football players with bad knees, a lot of football players with shoulder injuries that were able to become physically disqualified and not have to serve in the Army, in the military. There were also a lot of people that had less than debilitating medical situations. You've heard about President Trump didn't serve in Vietnam because he had bone spurs, and bone spurs would disqualify you from serving. There were also a lot of men who were able to get their doctors to write physical excuses so that they didn't have to serve. And those excuses could be almost anything if they had the right kind of doctor. Night blindness would get you out of serving. Now, actually, when I went in for my physical, I didn't do real well on the night blindness test, but they took me anyway. So I guess it didn't work for me. Only 30% of the soldiers who served in Vietnam were draftees. The others I call reluctant volunteers. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you were drafted into the Army, you served for 2 years. Let's see if I've got a slide on this. Yeah, you served for 2 years. The first 8 weeks was basic combat training. The next 8 weeks was advanced individual training, called it AIT. That AIT could be advanced infantry individual training. It could be advanced artillery. It could be advanced armor. It could even be advanced finance training if you got lucky enough to be in the finance corps instead of the infantry. After your 4 months of combat training, basic combat training, and another 4 months of AIT, you were given either a 15-day or a 30-day leave here in the States, and then you were deployed to Vietnam. You then, in Vietnam, you served 12 months if you were in the Army, or you served 13 months if you were in the Marines. Now, if you were in the Air Force or the Navy, you would also serve 1 year in Vietnam. But in order to be in the Air Force or to be in the Navy during the Vietnam War era, you had to enlist for a period of 4 years. So it was 4 years in the Navy or the Air Force, and it was only 2 years in the Army or the Marines. So a lot of people said, well, I don't want to spend 4 years, but if you did, the Navy and the Air Force got all the people that they wanted to be in their units because so many men didn't want to be in the Army or the Marines. So from that perspective, they volunteered. So when we say reluctant volunteers, I argue that since 70% were reluctant volunteers, those were the men that were concerned about being in the infantry. They didn't want to be in the infantry, so they chose to go in the Army. And if you enlisted in the Army, you served 3 years. So it was 3 years in the Army versus 4 years in the Air Force or 4 years in the Navy. But if you just got drafted, you only had to serve 2 years. So those were the options that were available to all of us who had to make a decision about what it was we were going to do with that period of time that was going to take us and put us at risk of having to go to Vietnam. While all of this was going on, there was also a huge anti-war movement. So I have a couple of signs up here of the anti-war movement. Now, some people argue it wasn't so much just an anti-war movement, it was an anti-draft movement. And it was all over the college campuses of America, meaning that if you didn't want to go in the Army and you were on a college campus, you would have a lot of friends that were in the same situation you were in. So the greatest anti-war activity took place on college campuses because that's where so many men had gone to school to stay out of having to go in the military by keeping their 2S deferments. But that 2S deferment would eventually run out when you graduate or when you drop below a 2.0 GPA. And what I want you to all think about, especially you men that are in this audience, this was you 50 years ago. This was your group. This was your age group 50 years ago. So the anti-war movement, rampant on college campuses. There is an organization called the Students for a Democratic Society. This is the SDS. Vietnam for the Vietnamese. End the war in Vietnam now. Stop the killing. SDS was started in Port Huron, Michigan by a bunch of American students at the University of Michigan. Port Huron was where they had their retreat and where they organized the Students for a Democratic Society. It was considered to be a leftist, almost a leftist communist organization. It wasn't, but that's what the FBI thought of it as. And if you were a member of SDS, it wouldn't keep you out of the military, but it would keep you out of officer candidate school. And it would keep you from getting a security clearance if you wanted to be an officer or if you wanted to be in certain sensitive positions in the military. Students for a Democratic Society. It was founded by a man by the name of Tom Hayden. You can write his name down, Hadyn, Hadyn. And he ultimately married this woman. Her name is Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda. This is a picture of her in Hanoi, where she traveled to Hanoi and got her pictures taken with the enemy, the North Vietnamese soldiers. She was very much criticized for it. She's still an actress today. I think she's about 79 or 80 years old today. Her husband, Tom Hayden, she later divorced him. And Tom Hayden just died last year, or a year before, I guess it was. He was the head of the SDS. She married him. And Jane Fonda, even to this day, a lot of Vietnam veterans are very critical of her for having succumbed to the propaganda of the North Vietnamese, our enemy. You talk to some Vietnam veterans, if you've got a grandpa or an uncle, you mention Jane Fonda, they probably won't say very many things nice about her. Here's another picture of an anti-war demonstration. See what kind of signs we've got here. Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? That was a chant. Support our boys, bring them home now. You'll see a flag. This is black and white, but you'll see the flag here of the National Liberation Front. Let me see if I've got a clicker here. Yeah, here's a flag of the National Liberation Front, the VC. There's a US flag there. There's probably a flag over here somewhere of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the enemy. So it's very common to see Americans carrying the flag of the enemy. Here's Jane. There's a nice sign, fuck the draft. There's a guy burning his draft card. It was one of those things that you did at anti-war demonstrations. It was against the law to burn your draft card, but guys did it anyway. And in some cases, they probably burned something that wasn't the draft card, but it pretended it was the draft card, or they made a copy of their draft card and burned their draft card. It's against the law, but nobody got arrested for it that I know of. And of course, that was very common to say, fuck the draft. Now, I will apologize for this sign, for this poster, but it is a real poster. It is sexist, obviously. Girls say yes to boys who say no. And you know what that means. This was the idea that women who had boyfriends that were subject to the draft would try to talk them out of going into the army. And you had some options. If you didn't want to go in the army, if you didn't want to go in the military by being drafted into it, you had some options, notwithstanding what I've talked about, to become 4F. You also had such options as, in my case, I lived in Detroit, Michigan. All I had to do was to go downtown Detroit and walk across the Ambassador Bridge, or get someone to drive me through the tunnel, and I would be in Windsor, Canada. And once you were in Canada, you were safe. You could not be drafted if you happened to be in Canada. The Canadian government did nothing to make us go home from Canada. They embraced us because Canada, as a country, was against the war in Vietnam. In fact, we had very few allies in the war. Some soldiers served from Korea. Some soldiers served, actually there was about maybe 1,000 or two soldiers from Canada that actually served. I think 185 Canadian soldiers were actually killed in Vietnam. But generally speaking, you could leave America, go to Canada, and you were safe. You could also go to Sweden. Sweden welcomed American draft dodgers. That's generally what we called those who decided not to go. We called them draft dodgers. So I want to talk a little bit about some other groups in the war in Vietnam. And I've got this picture up here of African American soldiers. 275,000 African Americans served in Vietnam. In the early days of the war, African American soldiers were killed at a disproportionate rate. In the United States at that time, approximately 12% of the population were African American. Approximately about the same percentage of those that were eligible for the draft, 12%. But in the first days of the war, the first years of the war, I would say in both 1965 and 1966, when we started putting American ground troops into the war, African Americans died at a rate of about 25% instead of 12%. We would expect 12%, but they died at almost double the rate. The leader of the African American civil rights movement at the time was a guy by the name of Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King was very concerned. Why is Why are we dying at a rate twice as high as white soldiers? And the argument was that there were more black soldiers in infantry jobs than in the rear. Remember, I talked about eight out of 10 of the soldiers were in the rear anyway, but most of them were white, and the black guys were in the infantry units, and they were dying. They were getting killed. Why was that? Well, I have an explanation for that I've written about in my first book, Not a Gentleman's War, and I have some of those things up here. In the beginning days of the war, the most elite units that fought in the war were the 101st Airborne Division and the 173rd Airborne Brigade and the 82nd Airborne Division. And I put all of those pictures up there the other day, certainly a picture of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, as I recall. A lot of black soldiers volunteered to jump out of airplanes. And one of the reasons for that is that if we jumped out of airplanes, we were making, enlisted soldiers in those days were making $95 a month. That was the salary of an enlisted private in the Army. If you jumped out of airplanes, you got an additional $65. So you're making $95 and you're getting an additional $65 for jumping out of an airplane. That's almost, that's time and a half. So that's pretty significant. So a lot of guys volunteered to jump out of airplanes. So when the war started, the most elite units were the airborne units. They were assigned to areas of high enemy concentration, meaning the 173rd and the 101st Airborne Division. These were the guys, the Screaming Eagles, American 82nd, 173rd Airborne Brigade. All these guys were sent to the most difficult places in Vietnam to serve. As a result of that, they were in the heaviest enemy contacts. Most of the platoon leaders were white officers. Now, one of the arguments was white officers sent black soldiers, put them in the most difficult positions of walking point because they were expendable. Now, I reject that argument. I know of no situations where that was the case, even though white officers, black soldiers. What I do know was the case is the fact that a lot of white officers chose the very best men to walk point. They chose the men to walk point that could keep all of their men alive. And the best soldiers, quite frankly, were black soldiers. One of the arguments as to why they were so good is a lot of them had grown up in the streets of Detroit. A lot of them had grown up in Cleveland. A lot of them had grown up in New York, in Harlem, and in Watts in California. And they had street smarts about them. They knew how to defend themselves. They knew how to be sensitive to issues around them. They were good thinking men whose ideas was to do the very best they could to stay alive themselves, and in the process of staying alive, keeping a lot of the unit alive. So I give a lot of credit to these African-American soldiers. The other thing that they did that I think we need to acknowledge is they came home from Vietnam after their tour of duty, and they were kind of pissed off because a lot of them were from the South. And African-American soldiers couldn't go in restaurants in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana because they were black. So they had to eat outside or in another room. And they had just been in Vietnam trying to save the lives of Vietnamese, keep freedom in Vietnam, and they didn't have freedom in Alabama. And a lot of those guys were pretty pissed off. I'll talk about this later in the course when we talk about the growth of the Black Panther Party. A lot of those guys were Vietnam veterans that felt like, wait a minute, what's the deal? I'm not free in America, but I'm fighting for the freedom of Vietnamese in Vietnam. Made no sense to them, and it's very understandable. Let me talk a little bit about women in Vietnam. I have a picture up here of an American nurse. Nurses were terrific. Nurses in Vietnam, all 100% of the women who served as nurses volunteered. Now, we did draft some male nurses, and we drafted, if you can believe this, we drafted doctors. Doctors who would become officers. Doctors would become captains and majors, and the nurses would become second lieutenants and first lieutenants. The nurses all volunteered to be there. They were terrific. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital in Pleiku with malaria, and the nurses were unbelievable. You see this nurse wearing Army fatigues. There was this battle, you might call it, this discussion that went on with General Westmoreland that I showed you a picture of on Tuesday. The General Westmoreland didn't like his nurses wearing green fatigues like we wore. He wanted his nurses to wear white nurses' uniforms and to wear lipstick and makeup so that the men that were in the hospital could wake up from their surgery and see beautiful women nurses. That was a terrible sexist thing and sexist attitude for Westy to take. Because quite frankly, these women were terrific soldiers. And when you think about the job of a nurse, they were involved in what we call triage. They were the ones who, in a mass casualty situation, they were the ones that when the choppers landed with wounded American and Vietnamese soldiers, and sometimes even enemy soldiers, it was up to that nurse to make some decisions. She would first make a decision about what we call expectance. That is someone who was expected to die, somebody that wouldn't make it out of an operating room. She then made the decision about the walking wounded, and then she made the decision about those who could be saved. It wasn't a doctor that made that decision in a mass casualty situation. It was the nurse. And so these nurses would take a man, a young boy, usually 19, 17, 18 years old, who was expected to die, and they would put that man over in a corner, and they would assign a nurse. Often it was a new nurse to hold that soldier's hand while he died. And as that soldier was laying there, gasping his last breath, that nurse would listen to him call for mommy, say things like, would you please let my wife know, let my mother know that my last days that I died like a soldier. And those nurses would have to listen to that and have to deal with that. So in a lot of ways, the nurses never had a break. Every single day in mass casualty situations, they had to live with this. I argue that, and I've done a lot of research on nurses, wrote a few papers on nurses, and what I found so often was that these nurses came home to America, to a nation that really wasn't very welcoming to those of us who came home from the war. Hard for you to believe, because now we say thank you for your service to everybody that comes home from Iraq and Afghanistan, as we should. But in those days, we took it out on the soldiers. But when the nurses came home, they were not even acknowledged as having been soldiers. They were looked upon as, well, why would you do that? Why would you go over there? Well, a lot of the nurses joined up to become nurses in hospitals in America. And as a result of there being nurses in the hospitals in America, they found being a nurse in America to be a terrible job, because they ended up emptying bedpans and doing the things that even today a lot of nurses are not respected for. Whereas in Vietnam, they were officers. They were either a second or a first lieutenant, and they were respected. Not so much back here in the States. I take my hat off to any nurses that served in Vietnam, to any of you who are going into, any of you that are going into a nursing field. Both my brother and my sister-in-law are nurses in Michigan. I have a lot of respect for nurses, and any of you that have been in the hospital, I hope you feel the same way. They were absolutely terrific in Vietnam. Yeah, 68,000 served. They were junior officers. Let me tell you a little bit about the donut dollies too. The donut dollies, and I do not consider that to be a pejorative term. They loved that term, donut dollies. They were Red Cross volunteers who came to Vietnam and did a lot of things, helping soldiers, going out into the field often, to just be, to talk, to be around Americans who hadn't seen an American woman for so many months. They were absolutely terrific, and they kept our mind off of what it was we were having to do in our jobs. Now, Americans like to fight our wars comfortably. I mentioned this on Tuesday. Here is the base camp at Cu Chi, which is a little town not too far from Saigon. About 10,000 American soldiers served here, with MOSs like lifeguard and armorer and supply and personnel and non-combat situations. We like to fight our wars in comfort. So that one had 10,000. Bars, swimming pools, massage parlors, officers clubs, NCO clubs. And we employed a lot, thousands of Vietnamese, and some of those Vietnamese were spies. We didn't know it at the time, but we always expected that anything we said or anything they saw could be transferred over to the Viet Cong. So let me talk a little bit about, first of all, the enemy soldiers. They were also drafted. Here's a picture of a People's Army of Vietnam soldier. This is an enemy soldier, a soldier who would serve from, who would be in from Hanoi, most likely. Here he is. You can see he's a little bit older. They were not in for 2 years like American soldiers. They were in for duration of the war or until they were killed. They didn't have the luxury of a tour of duty. They had to fight until the war was over. Now, this is actually a soldier. He's got it looks like an AK-47 there with a bayonet. Yeah, a hinged bayonet right here. These guys were highly trained and motivated. They were drafted. They served until the military ended, and they wore uniforms and had good equipment supplied to them by the Soviet Union, the Communist Soviet Union, and the Communist People's Republic of China. They also carried weapons made in Communist Czechoslovakia, in Communist Romania, in Communist Yugoslavia, in countries that were part of the Soviet bloc. And then there were these guys, the National Liberation Front, the VC. As you can see, no uniforms. They wore their own clothes. Generally, we would find them wearing black pajamas, black pajamas. We used to say they fought their war mostly at night. In the daytime, they were soldiers. Now, these guys, some of them, the guy in the front looks a little bit young. Third guy back doesn't look quite as young. They wore a little bit about the NLF soldier. He was a reluctant volunteer. He wore black pajamas. He served until the wars ended. We called him Charlie, or we called him Chuck, or we called him, when he was kicking our butts, Mr. Charles. These guys were really good soldiers, and they had to be careful to not show their identity because the Americans would kill them. So they hid amongst the civilians in the villages and the hamlets. And then here is a woman Viet Cong. And yes, there were a lot of women Viet Cong. If you are a revolutionary military, a guerrilla military, if you are a unit whose job it is to be insurgents, then you have to draft anyone. And women were as much a part of these guerrilla units as men. Almost every battle I was ever in, I think, every battle with Viet Cong, we would find, after it was over, we would find dead women who had served. And then there's these guys, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. These were our allies. You can see here uniforms. Most of them are carrying M16 rifles. They were well equipped. And there is a controversy about them. Most of them were drafted, but they only had to serve 3 years, not until the war was over. They had good uniforms. And there is a controversy that exists about the quality of those soldiers. That is, were they any good? There is a myth, I believe, that they were cowards. I served alongside these soldiers, and I never found them to be cowards. I found them to be dedicated soldiers who were trying their best to keep their South Vietnamese government free. Now, there is a controversy that does exist about the quality of the government of Vietnam, about the quality of the leadership. But there should be no qualification, there should be no controversy over the fact that the soldiers themselves were pretty good soldiers. I'm going to let you ask questions now about anything that I talked about today, because on Thursday, next Tuesday, I'm going to take these soldiers into battle across Vietnam. So for right now, you can ask any questions you might want to know about the American soldier or the Vietnamese.
Question.
Aaron.
Yes. So the first Vietnamese soldier you spoke of, ones that were highly trained, motivated, and had standard military uniforms and equipment, the guy with the AK that you showed us.
Yes.
What was his classification as far as which side he was on?
Oh, yeah, that was a communist soldier, and we call it the PAVN, the People's Army of Vietnam. If you talk to your uncle or your grandpa or somebody, they would have called them NVA soldiers, North Vietnamese Army. But the actual name was the People's Army of Vietnam.
How's it a distinction from the Viet Cong or the NLF?
The Viet Cong were all from the South. They were an insurgency, a guerrilla units that lived in the South that fought with the North. Okay.
Gotcha.
So the North think of the Northern soldiers as being a regular army unit, whereas the National Liberation Front in the South were guerrilla fighters. However, the guerrilla fighters in the South were actually organized into military units. We just didn't know that much about them because they were generally hiding in units where we couldn't exactly know. But now that the war's over, we know they were just as organized as the guys up north. And they fought together and they communicated with each other so that there would be battles in the South where there would be both Southern Viet Cong fighting with Northern communist soldiers.
Gotcha. That is one question. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Rowan.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay, I have a question regarding the donut dollies.
Yes.
What did they do exactly?
Well, they would come in. First of all, they were Red Cross volunteers, and they would come into units in the field or even on division headquarters, but mostly out in the field. They would be brought out there, and as silly as it seems, they would bring games like Monopoly, and they would bring games like Scrabble, and they would organize games to play with the soldiers. Now that would seem maybe silly to you, but I'll tell you what, if you've been out in the field for 2 weeks and you come in and you catch a quick shower and a beautiful woman from Detroit, Michigan wearing a white dress says you want to play Scrabble, you sure as hell want to play Scrabble.
All right, thank you.
And they were really terrific. I know some of them now, they're 70-year-old women, and they're very proud of the service that they did. They didn't have to do that, and they did it. And so I'm very proud to say that I never, ever met a donut dolly that I didn't fall in love with. They were just terrific in all respects. And I say fall in love with not in a romantic way. I just thought very highly of them.
All right, thank you.
Nathaniel.
No question.
I was wondering if you could pop up the rear echelon slide again. I didn't get that completely written down.
The rear echelon slide. It's just a picture of Cu Chi, I think.
No, it had like base camp for 10,000 starters, bar, swing, pearls, massage parlors.
Stop me if you see it. There you go.
There we go.
Okay.
So I have a question.
Yes, Juanita.
Yes, you're talking about 4 years in the Navy and will be 2 years in the Army or the Air Force. Which one is it?
You were 4 years in the Air Force, 4 years in the Navy, 2 years in the Army if you were drafted, 3 years if you enlisted, volunteered that is, and in the Marines it was 2 years if you were drafted, 3 years if you volunteered. In other words, if you volunteered, you paid a price for staying in longer, but you were going to be safer because your military occupational specialty, MOS, would not be as a combat soldier.
Okay. Thank you.
Good.
Who else? No more questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, I will see you all next Tuesday, and we'll take these men into battle at a place called Ia Drang, Idrang Valley. If you've not seen a movie called We Were Soldiers, that's what this lecture next week will be sort of about, the beginning of that. I call it the era of big battles, and the first big battle, and actually the largest battle of the whole war, is going to take place on November 15 and 16 of 1965. I'll put up some slides. We'll talk about it then, okay? Y'all have a good weekend, and I will see you next Tuesday.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.